Welcome to another class with Web Yeshiva. I'm continuing the series on Shemoneh Esrei, and we are now up to the blessing against heretics, Vela Malshinim. So let's go. I guess, assuming you have, whether you have some knowledge or not of this, I'll start with the questions and then we'll work backwards. This is the 19th blessing, right? We call it the Shemoneh Esrei because it has 18 blessings. I spoke at the beginning about how at one point there were 17 blessings, but the additional blessing is this blessing of Vela Malshinim for the heretics, as the Gemara says. So really, what's the purpose of this extra blessing? What changed that required this extra blessing? The Gemara says that the text was written by a rabbi called Shemoneh Katan. So I want to look at who was he? Why was he the one who could write this blessing and nobody else? And then, given that I think when the blessing was written had a very specific historical context, what relevance does it have to us nowadays or throughout history? Who are we talking about or what is going on? Now, this blessing, I guess, can be taken as controversial. I'm going to try and avoid the controversy because I don't think it's meant to be. I think if it's controversial, it's probably misinterpreted, or at least there are alternative interpretations. Okay, so the Gemara in Megillah, where we almost always start, which talks about the order of the Amida, right, says that last week we talked about returning the judges, right, that we're setting up courts of law. So kevan shenasu din min hirushaim. Once we've prayed for the courts to come and judge the wicked, kalu haposhim, then we pray for the end of the sinners, v'kolol zeidim emahem, and also the willful sinners. Now, the poshim are also willful sinners. Zeidim are willful sinners. I'm not going to go into the difference here and now, but it's also possible that the text of the Talmud was censored or changed. Shemoneh poshim v'chateim yachdav. He will destroy the sinners and the wicked together. So that is why Vela Malshinim follows after Shiva Shofteinu Kevarishona. Now the text of the blessing, this is the Ashkenazi text because I'm Ashkenazi, but most, I didn't look at, on the Hebrew Wikipedia page, there are about 20 different nuschaot. Most of them are more or less, most of these words, by and large, for the informers, let there not be hope. V'chol harisha kerega toved, all wickedness, may it instantly perish. V'chol oivecha meherei karetu, may all your enemies, meaning your God's enemies, be cut off. Vazedim meira te'aker, the willful sinners speedily be uprooted. Utshaper utmager v'tachnia b'mira v'yamenu, may they be wiped out, crushed away, whatever, etc. Speedily in our days. Baruch Hashem shover oivim u'machnia zedim, blessed are you who, whatever, crushes enemies, etc. So this is not against any specific, I'm not going to say it. Okay, that's straight. Now in the Cairo Geniza, there is a different version that was used in Israel, which is more specific. It says "L'mishumadim al titikva," and there are some people, some Siddurim nowadays that have this text. "L'mishumadim" means the apostates, people who've turned away from Judaism. Umalchut zadon merat, and may the wicked kingdom be destroyed. Va'notzrim va'menim keregi avedu, and may the Christians and the heretics be destroyed. Yimchu missefer chaim, may they be wiped from the book, erased from the book of life. V'im tzadikim al yechtevu, do not write them with the righteous. Baruch Hashem machnia zidim, blessed you who subdues the wicked. So this is much more specific that it's talking about Christians. I understand why modern Siddurim don't include this text. And that's why it's controversial, but also I don't believe it's talking about the Christians of nowadays, as we'll see. I think it was a very specific, timely issue at the beginning of Christianity, which is no longer relevant nowadays. Nativ Bina, I mentioned last week, is a book about the Siddur, and he quotes somebody else who I can't remember, who says the following: Mitchila patcha bracha lo b'tev mashlim ela leminim v'lemeshumadim. Initially, the blessing didn't start with the slanderers, but rather the heretics and the apostates. V'achar kach niskru ba poshim v'zeidim, and it mentions the wicked, Malchut Zadon, the wicked kingdom. V'aday gam notzrim, and certainly also the Christians. So Hashemot, that's a type of min, minut. When the phrase min or minut, which translates as heretic, I suppose the Rambam gets more specific as to what kind of heresy, but they call it gam min, kol min kfirav apikrosot. I'm sorry about the typos, I had to type this out. This includes all of the types of heresy and apikrosot, again, Epicureans, but it doesn't mean that. Now, there are Batiat Stukim, Shomronim, Hanotzrim, Hagnostikaim. This includes the Sadducees, the Samaritans, the Christians, and the Gnostics. And therefore, there's a big dispute about the real intent of the blessing of the minim, because that can mean many things. Mainly because minim is a word that was substituted by the censors for whatever the real meaning was. But he says, and I agree, there's no doubt that this prayer was established against the Christians, lavdilam midat Yisrael, to separate them from the Jews, meaning the Christians back when Christianity was a subgroup of Jews, when they were Jewish Christians. Not the Christianity of nowadays, not the Christianity of post-Nicaea, not the Christianity of 3rd or 4th century, but the Christianity of the 1st century, 2nd century maybe, when the difference between Christians and Jews was, you wouldn't have known who was who, except the beliefs, right? The Christians would pray together with all the other Jews. Nobody stopped them. And there was no reason to stop the Christians coming and praying in the Jewish synagogues. They also would daven for the Amud. They would be the Shliach Tzibor. And this prayer was written to separate between the Jews and the Christians, so that they should become two separate religions and not be confused as to who is who. Which answers the question of why it had to be established at the time it was. That was the time that Christianity was more than a small cult, was a significant threat to Judaism and needed to be separated out, the Christians and the Jews. And the fact of reciting a prayer against Christians meant the Christians wouldn't be able to say that prayer, and therefore they would stop coming to shul, and therefore there'd be a separation. So I'm going to take a digression and talk about when it was established and by whom. So Tana Rabbanan, it was taught in a brighter Shemoneh HaPekuli Estir Shemona Esrei Brachot Lifnei Rabban Gamliel Al Aseh B'Yavne. Shemoneh HaPekuli, I don't know very much about him, but he he arranged the 18 blessings that had been composed by the men of the Great Assembly some 400, 500 years earlier. He arranged it before Rabban Gamliel in Yavne, right? So soon after the destruction of the Second Temple, when the center of Judaism moved from Jerusalem to Yavne, Rabban Gamliel is the Nasi, and he's setting out making the Siddur. And so Shemoneh HaPekuli says, here's what we're supposed to say in the Shemoneh Esrei. Amar lehem Rabban Gamliel HaChachamim. So what are we talking about? The mid-2nd century, right? So Rabban Gamliel said to early 2nd century. Rabban Gamliel said to the Chachamim, Klom yesh adam she'yodeh letaken birkat haminim. Do we have anybody here who can write a blessing, create a new blessing against the minim, right? And I think he means the Christians. Amar Shmuel HaKatan v'tikna. So Shmuel HaKatan, Shmuel the small, Shmuel the lesser, humble Shmuel, got up and he wrote the prayer. wrote. He didn't write it because it was all oral, but he just said the prayer. The Shana Acheret Shachar, but the year later, he forgot the prayer. He stood and tried to remember it. 2 or 3 hours it took him until he could remember the words. And in that time, they didn't get rid of him. They didn't replace him as Shliach Tzibor. They all sat and waited quietly while he remembered the words. Okay, so the Gemara asks, well, I would ask, why was it only next year that he prayed again? Why wasn't he doing it every year? I don't have an answer, so I'm going to move on to the Gemara's question. Why didn't they replace him as the Shliach Tzibor? Hama Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Ta b'chol brachot kulan. Rav Yehuda taught in the name of Rav that if somebody makes a mistake in the blessing when he's the Shliach Tzibor, ein mali noto. You don't have to remove him from being Shliach Tzibor. And Yored, nowadays we go up to the bima. In their days they went down to the bima, and so you'd go Yored lefnei teva, and if you're removing somebody, you'd bring them up again. Anyway, so every other bracha, if someone makes a mistake, just that's fine. However, if they make a mistake and the blessing gets heretics, ma'alinoto, you replace them. Because we're concerned that maybe he is a heretic himself, and that's why he can't come out with the prayer. Therefore, we don't want him leading the prayers. So why didn't they remove Shmuel HaKatan? And the Gemara says, first of all, well, he wrote the thing. He can't be a heretic if he wrote the prayer. And then the Gemara says, but maybe he converted, maybe he changed. So the answer is Shiny Shmuel HaKatan to Ehud Takna, right? He established it. Nechosh Dil Mahadrabe. The Gemara says, maybe he's retracted, maybe he's converted. Amrabai Gmira Tavalai Havabisha. So then Abaya has a principle that a good person can't go bad, and the Gemara plays with that and rejects that idea, and then says Shiny Shmuel HaKatan et Chilba. This is different. In this case, Shmuel began the blessing, right? And he just couldn't remember the middle of it or the end of it, but he knew he was definitely committed to saying the blessing. There's no fear that he's a heretic. Rav Yehuda Item Rav Yeshua ben Levi, because either Rav Yehuda says the name of Rav or Yeshua ben Levi says, this idea that we replace the Shaliach Tzibor if he can't say the prayer of the heretics is only if he refuses to begin, can't begin it. But if he began, we let him finish. Okay, so let's talk about Shmuel HaKatan. Why was he the only rabbi in Yavne who was able to write this prayer? I mean, writing prayers is hard work, obviously, and nobody had really written a prayer in a few hundred years. But it seems strange that he's the only person there. He wasn't the greatest rabbi. He wasn't the most famous rabbi. Certainly not prolific in terms of what we have in the Gemara. So actually take a step backwards. Rambam says why they needed this blessing then, and the answer is B'yamei Rabban Gamliel Rabu HaApikosim B'Yisrael. In the time of Rabban Gamliel, there increased the number of heretics amongst the Jews. Vayu mitzerim liYisrael u'mesitim otan lishuv ma'achrei Hashem. Now, I think when he says Apikosim, I think, again, it's referring to Christians, and they would both oppress the Jews and try and entice them to convert to their religion. When he saw this is the greatest threat to Judaism, so Rabban Gamliel stood up with his Beit Din and established this new prayer, that he would pray to God to destroy these heretics. And he has made it part of the prayer, so that everybody would know it, be saying it, and would be aware of the threat. And therefore, in the 18 blessings, it turns out we have 19 because this is the additional blessing added in. So it was made at a very specific time for a very specific threat. So now let's talk about Shmuel HaKatan, who he was and why he was the rabbi who was able to write this prayer. I'll rephrase it. Why he was the rabbi who was able to write any prayer. Gemara in Ta'anit. Now, Ta'anit is about fasting, but it's about fasting for rain, primarily, most of it. Praying for rain, and various places it talks about different rabbis who prayed for rain and how successful their prayers were. So Shmuel HaKatan Gazar Ta'anita. One time Shmuel HaKatan said, we're going to fast tomorrow. starting in the morning, we're going to fast because we need the rain. And rain fell before they even had time to pray Shachrit, before they even started their fast. The rain fell. So everyone thought, wow, we're really good. God answers our prayers before we even do the thing, before we even fast. Shmuel says, not so fast, guys. Let me give you an analogy. What's this like? It's like a servant who asks for something from his master. The master says, just give him what he wants. I don't want to have to deal with him. I don't want to have to listen to him. So it's not because God liked them so much, but because the opposite. God didn't want to have to deal with them, so he just gave them what they wanted. That was Shmuel's first answer. Another time, Shuv Shmuel Hakatan Gazati Nita. Another time he declared a fast. And they fasted all day long, and only after the sunset, then the rain came. So God listened to their prayers all day long. So the people remembered what Shmuel Hakatan said last time, and they thought, great, we must be the best guys ever because God listened to our prayers all day long. He must love us. Shmuel said, no, guys, not so fast. It's not because God loves you. It's not great. Let me give you another analogy. Like a servant who asks for something from his master, and the master says, wait until he's worn himself out and he's in pain, and only then do you give him what he wants. So whichever way, whatever happens, Shmuel doesn't want people to get too big for their boots, which is one of the reasons he's called Shmuel HaKatan, right? It's the small one, you're not big for his boots. So what would it look like? In what cases would Shmuel HaKatan be prepared to praise the community for their righteousness? If the Shaliach Tzibor says, who causes the wind to blow, and at that moment the wind started blowing, and if he says causes the rain to fall, and the rain falls at that moment, that would be okay. That's a pretty good trick, but that's never going to happen. Whatever you do, it's never going to be good enough. Shmuel HaKatan is never going to say you can rest on your laurels. You're a great guy. You're a great community. The most famous thing Shmuel HaKatan said is in Pirkei Avot. Shmuel HaKatan Omer, B'nfol oivecha al tismach, ובחשלו al יגע ליבך, פן ירא השם, ורע בעיניו והשיב מעליו אפו. When your enemy falls, do not be happy. If he trips, don't be happy, lest God see that and it's bad in his eyes, and the evil falls on you. The strange thing about this Mishnah and the statement of Shmuel HaKatan, what makes it unique in Pirkei Avot, but possibly completely unique, is that he's just quoting a verse. Everything he says at Shmuel HaKatan Omer should say Shlomo HaMelech Omer. King Solomon said this in Proverbs. Shmuel just quotes something from Tanakh. How come it's in his name? How come he merits to have this in Pirkei Avot? So I found online a commentary. I was going to say, I know you won't believe me, but I was going to say something along these lines, but I found someone else who said it, so I'm quoting this. He's in Sefaria. I don't know very much about him, but he has a Wikipedia page, so you can look him up. He says the most interesting thing about the saying is that it is only a verse from the book of Proverbs. Whereas in every other case in the Mishnah, there are words of the rabbis, this Mishnah contains only a biblical verse. While there are some versions of this Mishnah in which there appears a midrash, in which case Shmuel HaKatan does add his own words, and is not merely quote a verse, these are probably later versions and do not reflect the original. The traditional explanation for this phenomenon is that Shmuel HaKatan regularly quoted this verse. The verse's meaning is that one should not rejoice at the fall of one's enemy, and if one does, God's wrath will be placed upon the one rejoicing. It means the point is not that Shmuel HaKatan knows a verse from Mishlei, but rather his whole life. He dedicated himself to not rejoicing at the downfall of others. And therefore, it merits, people would see him and they'd say, oh, that's Shmuel HaKatan. He always says, don't laugh at downfall of others. And that's why, presumably, he's the one who can establish a prayer praying for the downfall of others, because he's not doing it, because he'll be happy by it, or because there's some benefit to him from it. He's doing it purely for the sake of the Jewish people, for the reason that Rabban Gamliel wants to separate these Judeo-Christians from Jews. So he seems best placed to do this thing because he won't enjoy it, he won't rejoice, and he won't think himself that he's better than them, as based on the previous Gemara in Tanit. And here in Sanhedrin we have another example of how humble Shmuel HaKatan is, and ends up really being likened by the Gemara to God. So the story was Tan Rabbanan ein mavrin et hashna ela b'mezumanim la. When you're working out leap years and such and so on with the Sanhedrin, you have to be invited. The Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, will call in whoever he wants, 3 or 5 or 7 people, depending on what's going on. So you need 7. Only those who are invited may be part of it. Ma'aseh Rabban Gamliel. So one time Rabban Gamliel, right, the same one who kind of re-established the Siddur the Amida, Shamar Hishkimu li Shiva Laliyah. He invited 7 people to come up to his attic where he was going to convene the Beit Din. So Hishkimu Matzah Shemoneh. He got there and there were 8 rabbis there, not 7. So Rabban Gamliel said, listen, the guy who didn't get the invite should leave now, please. Right? This reminds you of the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa a little bit, doesn't it? He's saying, I don't want extra people. I invite a set number of people, and one guy is without an invitation. That's no good. I'm the guy. I'm the extra guy who came without permission. And I didn't come to be part of your Beit Din. I just came to learn how you can do this, how this halacha works. I wanted to watch the Beit Din in action. I'm the extra guy. Amalos Rabban Gamliel says, Shev b'ni, Shev, sit down. Sit where you are. Royat kol hashnim kolan litabe al yadecha. I wish you could do all the new months to calculate the years. But the rabbi said only those were invited, and you weren't invited. So stay here, watch. You're a great guy, but no. And the Gemara says, it wasn't Shmuel HaKatan who came without an invite. Somebody else showed up without the invite. Shmuel HaKatan did this so as not to embarrass somebody else. So he put himself out there and said it was my fault, when it absolutely was not him at all. And he did that to save someone else from humiliation. Now the Gemara then says other examples of other rabbis who did a similar thing, that not to embarrass people who learned it, Rebbe and Rebbe Meir, and they learned it from Shmuel HaKatan. And the Gemara says, where did Shmuel HaKatan learn this from, that you should degrade yourself to avoid embarrassing others? Shmuel HaKatan meichi gamir la. So where did he learn it? He learned it from Shemoneh ben Yechiel. It's a pasuk in Ezra. I'm sure you're about as familiar with it as I am. But Shemoneh ben Yechiel mibnei Elim va'amar leEzra anachnu ma'aleinu belokeinu v'nashav nashim nachriot me'am ha'aretz v'ataish mikvei Yisrael al zod. He says, we've all done the wrong thing. We've married non-Jewish women, and what hope do we have? And he was confessing to a sin that he hadn't done. He didn't want to embarrass anybody else, so he said, all of us together are in the same boat. And where does Shemoneh learn it from? Shemoneh ben Yechiel mehecha gamala mi Yehoshua. He learned it from Yehoshua. Says the Gemara, Dichtiv v'yomer Hashem al Yehoshua, kum lech lama ze ata nofel panecha chata Yisrael. Now, really, it wasn't Yeshua. It's God talking to Yeshua, right? The Jews lost, the Israelites lost the battle of Ai. Yeshua is very upset and says, God, tell me, why did we lose the battle of Ai? And God says, get up, stop falling on your face. The Jews have sinned. Yeshua says, well, tell me who it is, God. Who sinned? Amar lo akidili torani. God says, am I going to say lashon hara about somebody? Hatel go a lot. Do a lottery to figure out who it is who sinned. So it's really God who says, I'm not going to point the finger at anybody. You're all in this together. I'm not singling anybody out. And I'm, yeah. Moshe. Otherwise, maybe he learned it from Moshe, again, from God. Dichtiv ad ana me'antim. God says to Moshe, how long are you, plural, going to be rebelling against my mitzvot? Meaning that God doesn't want to call out an individual. He'd rather make collective blame rather than calling out an individual. And that's what Shmuel HaKatan did. And that's maybe why the prayer begins V'la Malshnim, those who do call out individuals who just gone blank on English, slanderers, those who slander others, right? That's the antithesis of what Shmuel HaKatan was. Yeah, okay, Ilanit, I think, I mean, I think the meaning of it is not the sinners, but the sin. In other words, we're praying for them to repent fundamentally, but those who don't want to, we want them to be far away from us. So I don't know if I'll change the words of the prayer, but I agree with your interpretation of it. The Sechet Smachot. I'm just putting this in because, as you know, I like doing the whole story. Shmuel HaKatan, when he dies, he had no children. So the Masechet Smachot, I've probably said this before. It's one of the Masechet Tanot. It's printed at the end of the Gemara, or end of Nezikin, and it's a small tractate about the laws of mourning. It's called Happiness, but it's about mourning. And it says, Tolin maftacho upinkaso shel met ba'arono shel met mipnei agmat nefesh. The custom was to hang the keys and the notebook of somebody on their coffin to make people upset, to realize, this is the end of whatever the keys and book represent. Maybe the Pinkas is where they wrote down their good and bad deeds throughout their life. I'm not sure. Anyway, so Kshemet Shmuel HaKatan talu maftacho pinkaso ba'arono mibnei shelo haya lo ben. So when Shmuel HaKatan died, they hung his keys and his notebook on his coffin because he had no son. V'aya Rabban Gamliel Zaken v'Rebbe Eliezer ben Azariah maspitin alav. Rabban Gamliel and Rebbe Eliezer ben Azariah, the two Nesiim, right? Because Rabban Gamliel was deposed and Rebbe Eliezer ben Azariah replaced him, and then they did a deal. They did 3 weeks and 1 week. They're both the two greatest leaders of that generation, eulogized him. V'omrim, they said, someone like this, it's appropriate to cry. Someone like this is appropriate to mourn. Melachim meitim u'menichim kitreim levneihem. When kings die, they leave their crowns for their kids. They can't take their crowns with them. Asherim meitim menichim osher levneihem. When rich people die, they can't take it with them. They leave their wealth to their children. But Shmuel HaKatan natal kol hachamudot sheba'olam v'alach lo. Shmuel HaKatan, his greatness was not that he was a king and not that he was rich, but his Torah, and he took his Torah with him to the next world. And then this brighter ends. Just before he died, on his deathbed, Shmuel HaKatan made this prophecy and said, Shimon v'Yishmael lacharava. Shimon and Yishmael will be killed by the sword. Shar kol am lebiza akan segin Yahava nachren. Ulbashon Amit Amran. And all the rest of the people will be, what does it say, spoiled, destroyed. And he said this in Aramaic. Now, I don't remember anywhere else that says he said it in Aramaic, especially when it's written in Aramaic. I don't know why he was speaking Aramaic when he lived in Yavne in Israel. I mean, I guess there was a passage in Aramaic at the time. Anyway, Shimon and Yishmael are two of the 10 martyrs, so he foretold their death at the hands of the Romans. Whether that's connected in any way to his prayer against the wicked or not, I don't know. I'm just putting it out there because we're talking about Shmuel HaKatan. So now, who are the heretics that we're talking about? And I guess I've got 3, 4 options. But I've already told you, I think the answer is the early Christians. So anyway, I'm going to start with Yared Dvash, written by Janusz Neibschitz. And I think this, I'm going to jump to the end and then back to the middle. One of the later historical parallels to early Christianity, I think, was the Sabbatine movement, where after the death of Shabtai Tzvi, most of the Jews who had followed him went back to their regular lives, went back home, picked up where they left off. But many of them continued to believe in Shabtai Tzvi and would go to shul and pray next to everyone. They don't all look the same, but they'd actually be praying 2, 4 Shabtai Tzvi, all sorts of prayers and ideas and Kabbalistic thoughts that were not appropriate, which is very similar to the early Christian movement, where everyone's praying together, but some were praying to Jesus or to God through Jesus, whatever, and some were not. I'm not going to go into this now, but Yaakov Emden accused Janusz Neibschitz of being a Sabbatine himself. Actually, it wasn't only Yaakov Emden, also other rabbis at that time accused him, and probably he was a Sabbatine. But somehow he was also the greatest rabbi in Europe at the time. So he interprets this he interprets it really as being about rabbis who accuse other rabbis of being heretics. But then he points it at Amalek. So so when you say this prayer, you should have in mind that there should be no heresy amongst the Jews. They should believe in the written and the oral Torah completely. There shouldn't be any wormwood and whatever it is, any questions or thoughts of heresy. They shouldn't go against the words of the rabbis. The rabbis who are great, who are perfect, who teach Torah in public. Right? I think he's saying this prayer is against those people who are accusing me of being a heretic. Right? I'm a rabbi. I teach. I'm the head of the 4 communities, not 1 community. Right? Everyone recognizes my greatness as a rabbi, so everyone else should not be accusing me of anything. And then he says also, you should also pray for the downfall of Amalek. We can all agree on that. Right? We're talking about the wicked kingdom. Shehu Amalek. That's always Amalek. Shabab is Adon al Yisrael, who comes willfully against the Jewish people. Mit aber al riv lo lo. He gets involved in a fight that's not his fight. And if you have that intent when you say this prayer, then you do the mitzvah of remembering what Amalek said to you. I think this is also a dig at Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who is accusing of getting involved in a fight he doesn't need to, and making a machloket for no reason. Yaakov Emden would say there very much was a reason, because Janusz Neibschitz was a heretic. So I like the fact that he's turned it around. Anyway, he won. His books are still in the Beit Midrash and the yeshivas today. So clearly he was not a heretic and not a Sabbatine. But that's how he understands Shalom al-Shani. I'll start. Yeah. I'll do it the other way around. I think I did this twice. Okay, good. So ignore that one. Avodat Yisrael in his commentary says, this prayer for Shalom al-Shani is against the Sadducees and against the Apikorasim, who increased at the time of Rabban Gamliel. They denied the validity of the oral law, and they denied there would be a Mashiach. And they also denied other principles of faith. They were causing other people to sin, leading them astray. And also they would slander, they would hand over the Jews who did believe to the Romans. rabot aleim, and in this way they caused lots of hardship to the Jewish people. Ve'tziku lehem b'ma'od, and they caused a lot of pain. V'yadua ki gdola tzara sheba le'uma yedei mitzikim ha'omdim b'kirbam. Right, it's known that the enemy within is greater, causes more pain. Ben haraha ba la ayedei tzorim zotam is greater than pain caused by outside enemies. Right, when we say Jews have always been their own worst enemies, that's how he understands this. So that's a good interpretation. My only real issue with that is that the Sadducees had their heyday 200 years earlier. Right, the Stukim were in the time of Yanai HaMelech, Shimon ben Shetach. That was the time they were running the show, which was 100 years before the destruction of the temple, not in the time of Rabban Gamliel, who was 30 years after the destruction of the temple. So it seems strange that they would establish the prayer then and not then. Unless he's talking metaphorically, he doesn't mean Sadducees. And he quotes this Rashi to show that internal enemies are worse than external enemies, where Rashi says, right, this is in the curses in Vayikra. It says, your enemies were all over you. The curse is that God will make your enemies from amongst you. If the other nations attack us, they try and take what they can see. Right? They see in Shoftim, they saw the Jews had some crops, they went and stole their crops. But when God makes your enemies from within you, from the Jewish people, they're going to look for not what they can see, but what they can't see as well. Etc. So, they whatever. Micha talks metaphorically that they ate the flesh of the people and took the skin and broke their bones and took the marrow from inside the bones. So Rashi or Siddur Avodat Yisrael say that the Malshanim are our own enemies, means the enemies are the Jews. And again, I think this fits in nicely with saying it's the Jewish Christians or the Christian Jews, the proto Christian Judeo-Christians. When we're talking about, and I don't really have time, but whatever, Velamal Shenim, talking about handing people over to the Romans, this is the most famous Gemara that talks about that. I'm sure you all know, if not this, but the next bit of the Gemara. So it talks about Rabbi Yehuda, and he's referred to as Rosh HaMidabrim B'Kol Makom. He's always the first speaker. And the Gemara asks, Amai Karolei Rosh HaMidabrim B'Kol Makom? Why was Rabbi Yehuda, he's a student of Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yossi. So why is Rabbi Yehuda always the one who speaks first? Diativ Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon. One time, and this does sound a bit Monty Python, I'm sorry, but one time Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Shimon were sitting, talking. Diativ Yehuda ben Gerim Gabayhu. And Yehuda ben Gerim, we don't know much about him except from the story. He was sitting nearby, or he's sitting with them. Patach Rabbi Yehuda v'amar, Rabbi Yehuda began his discussion and said, Kama na'im asehem shalom azo. How great are the Romans? Look what the Romans have done for us. Tiknu shvakim, tiknu ksharim, tiknu merchatzaot. They've established marketplaces, they've made bridges, they've made bathhouses. These Romans are great. Rabbi Yossi shatak, Rabbi Yossi didn't say anything. And Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai v'amar, Shimon ben Yochai says, don't praise them. They haven't done anything for us. Everything the Romans did, they did for themselves. They made markets because they want to have prostitutes. They made bathhouses because they wanted to make themselves look beautiful, to treat themselves. They made bridges to take taxes. They didn't do anything for us. Now, that's the end of the conversation. Halach Yehuda ben Gerim v'sipir divrei. Yehuda ben Gerim went off and told on them, said this is what happened. Maybe he didn't go directly to the Romans, but he said it in a way that the news got out of whose alliances was whose loyalty was with who. And Nishmu Malchut, the Romans heard about this. Amru, the Romans said, Yehuda she'elah Yit'aleh. Yehuda, who said nice things about the Romans, about us, he gets a promotion. He's going to be able to speak first every time. Yossi, Sheshatak, Yossi, who said nothing, Yigalel Tzipori, we're going to exile him to Tzipori. Shimon Shigana and Shimon ben Shetach, who said nasty things about the Romans, Yehareg, he'll be killed. As you know, he wasn't killed. He went and hid in a cave for 12 years with his son, 13 years, and the whole Lag BaOmer story and Shimon bar Yochai and all of that kind of stuff happened because of the story. But that's what Malshinim means. Right? Sorry, Malshim at the time of these rabbis, which is the generation after Rabban Gamliel. Rabbi Akiva is basically a contemporary of Rabban Gamliel. The next generation on, when the Romans hear about what's going on, they have the power to kill people or exile people. So that's the Malshinim, the slanderers. They're not just saying, oh, I don't like you, but they're saying things that cause people to get killed. So, as I said, I think it's because the rabbis made several laws or practices or abolished practices because of the Christians. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. This Gemara in Brachot is coming from starting on Yom Kippur and the temple service and what happens there. He says even outside of the temple, outside the temple they wanted to say the 10 Commandments as part of davening. In the same way that we say Shema Yisrael, they want to also say 10 Commandments. But the rabbi said you can't say the 10 Commandments as part of your prayer service because of the heretics. Now, heretics here means Christians, and if the Jews make that a central part of their davening, then the Christians will say there are only 10 Commandments. And the Jews say, no, they're not. There's 613 Commandments. So they didn't want to give any encouragement to the Christians. And of course, that's what happened nowadays. If you ask your average person in the street, average Christian person in the street, and possibly even Jewish person, how many commandments are there? Say 10. There's the 10 Commandments in the, outside the Supreme Court and in the state assemblies, etc., etc. So the rabbi said, we're not buying into this 10 Commandments business. That was the Bavli. Yerushalmi has the same thing. Ramati of Shmuel bar Nachmani Taveo Amrin Bedin Havesh Yokorin Asar Dibrot B'Chol Yom. Right? Really, the halacha should be that you would say the 10 Commandments every day. Why do we not say the 10 Commandments every day? Because of the heretics, we don't want them to say that Moshe only got 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. Charlton Heston, right? Their concern was valid. So what we see is they changed, they either removed something from the prayer or they didn't add something into the prayer because of the threat of Christians at the time. And again, I think it's fair to say Christians because who else believed in the 10 Commandments? And I want to tell you the story about Shimon ben Kippur, however, I don't know how to pronounce it. Many years ago, I gave a shir on this, which I was based on a shir I heard from Shneir Lehman. I highly recommend you going to hear Professor Shneir Lehman's shir, which is fantastic. His shir is on the 9th of Tevet. But anyway, just very quickly, here's the threat. Here's how bad the threat was that the Jews were up against with early Christians. Ketav, the Gemara of Avodah Zarah has this kind of throwaway line interpreting a verse saying their language is not theirs. And Rashi says in our version of the text, Ketav lashon shoramim milma acheret ba'alahen. The language of the Romans, the language and the writing of the Romans came from another nation. Achem tiknu kol sifrem, and other people wrote all of their books. Now this Rashi doesn't make sense because if you went to school and learned Latin, as I did, you know the Romans had their own language, and you know that the Romans had their own writers and wrote their own books. So maybe Rashi didn't know, but the reason this makes no sense is because the Rashi was heavily censored. If you look in Dikdukei Sofrim, at the uncensored version of Rashi, and it's very clear why it was censored, he says, this is what Rashi really said, Achem tiknu lehem kol sifrei ta'otam. Others wrote their books of errors, meaning their heretical books. Yochanan, Paulus, and Piro. Can't remember. I think is a typo. I can't remember who it was. So Yochanan, Paul, wrote the books of the New Testament. Vahem Yodim, how you write. The Romans became Christian, and these were Jews who wrote their books. Lashon hu chromatika hu alashon amajim bo galachim. When it says language, it means the grammatic language that that should be with a gimel, not a kuf, it's my typo, that the priests speak. Henu kohalashon. These Jews were the ones who set up this priestly language. V'asur lehem hevel. Again, it's a typo. They created this futility, the fnei the salkam Israel, and they did it in order to separate them from the Jewish people. Veloshik too many typos. Losh heminu, right? Is that right? Veloshik kafru. It wasn't that they denied God. They did it because for the benefit of the Jews. Because the Jews or they saw the Jews were suffering from the followers of Jesus. So these Jewish people, these made themselves as if they were also believers in Jesus. They led them astray, led them to set up a separate religion, made them more different than the Jews, so that you could tell them apart. And Rashi says all of this is in the book Tliat Yeshu, the book about the hanging of Jesus, Jesus crucifixion, which is a book called Sefer Toldot Yeshu. It goes without saying that it is not a historical book, not in any way authentic, but it was very popular in medieval Europe. Many different versions of it, and okay, fine. It's so you go online, you look for Toldot Yeshu, and here is just the last bit of it. In Toldot Yeshu, it says, and again, I took this just translation: the sages desired to separate from Israel those who continue to claim Yeshua as the Messiah. Right? It was the rabbi said we can't have this mixture between Jews and Christians. We need to know who's who. So they called upon the greatly learned man Shemoneh for help. Shimon went to Antioch, the main city of the Nazarenes, and proclaimed to them, that's not my typo, that says, I am the disciple of Yeshu. He sent me to show you the way. I will give you a sign as Yeshu had done. Right? So he was one of the rabbis, and he dressed up, or became the leader, went to the Christians and said, follow me, do what I say. And he gave them signs. Shimon, having gained the secret of the ineffable name, healed a leper and a lame man by means of it, and thus found acceptance as a true disciple. He told them that Yeshua was in heaven at the right hand of his Father, in fulfillment of Psalm 110. He added that Yeshua desired they separate themselves from the Jews and no longer follow their practices, as I had said, your new moons and your feasts my soul abhorreth. They were now to observe the first day of the week instead of the seventh, the resurrection instead of the Passover, the ascension into heaven instead of the Feast of Weeks, finding of the cross instead of the New Year, the Feast of Circumcision instead of the Day of Atonement, the New Year instead of Hanukkah. They were to be indifferent with regard to circumcision and the dietary laws. Also, they were to follow the teachings of turning the right if smitten on the left and the meek acceptance of suffering. All these new ordinances which Shemoneh, or Paul as he was known to the Nazarenes, taught them were really meant to separate these Nazarenes from the people of Israel and to bring the internal strife to an end. In other words, Christianity, as not as we have it today, but Christianity as it became known, was largely due to Paul, and Paul started preaching to non-Jews and did away with circumcision for non-Jews and moved Shabbat to Sunday. And all of these things, according to this story told at Yeshu, that Paul was a rabbi who did this intentionally to separate Jews from Christians, so you could tell who was who. And that was the end point, right? That final separation, when that became the accepted form of Christianity. It was before that the Vela Malshanim, the prayer against the heretics, came when they were intermingled. Shimon ben Kappa was the one who was able to separate them. And just when you're davening a shul on Shabbat, I don't know if how mainstream this is, but Siddur Avodat Yisrael is a mainstream siddur, and he suggests, well, Shamati mi Rabbi Yehuda ben Yaakov, Shubishum ben Kippur Yasad Nishmat. I heard that Shimon ben Kippur, this Paul, wrote the prayer Nishmat Kol Chai, Admir Melach. In another place I found was that Shimon ben Kappa Yeshua Mishum ben Shetach Yesadet Nishmat. That it was either Shimon ben Kippur, who founded Christianity, or Shimon ben Shetach, who fought against the Sadducees. They wrote Nishmat, Ramaz Shemo Bo Lemafreya, and wrote his name in the prayer backwards. Dainu Shin is Shochenad, Mem is Miyad Me, Ayin Ad Hena Azruni, Vav Elo Einenu, and Nun is Nishmat. So next on Shabbat, when you say Nishmat Kochai, you can think that there is an opinion that this was written by the rabbi who became the lead Christian and made kind of modern Christianity. Yes, exactly. Rabbeinu Tam Rashi, he believes, Rabbeinu Tam believes about Nishmat, or he believes about the origins of Christianity. I'm not sure which, but many of the Jews in Europe, okay, I didn't know that he said they're about Nishmat. But certainly many people believed in this Todos Isha Notzri. I'm running out of time. Okay. Midrash Tanchuma, right? The Gemara in Brachot had said if you make a mistake in the bracha of Filamal Shanim, they switch you. Shul should switch you with somebody else because maybe you're a heretic. Midrash Tanchuma has a slightly different variant on this. If you make a mistake, they force you to say it anyway and have everyone say Amen to you cursing yourself if you're a Christian. Fine. I just want to give a few later day examples of perhaps what early Christianity was like when it was unclear when people thought Christians posed as Jews, or the distinction between Jews and Christians was unclear. So I mentioned Shabtai Tzvi. I've spoken about him in the past. So I just very quickly want to talk about Jacob Frank in the 18th century. He was a Sabbatine, and then he became the leader, whatever. Either he was brilliant or he was a fool or whatever. He became the leader of this other movement of Sabbatines who became Christian ultimately. And they were the first, possibly the only, Jews who testified in Christian courts that Jewish practice was to kill Christian babies for Passover. They became so separated from the Jewish community by the end that they testified against them. But there's a great book by Paul Machieko, The Mixed Multitude. There's a Nobel Prize-winning book about the Book of Jacob, connected to Jacob Frank. But if you get a chance to read The Mixed Multitude, and he goes through some of the stories about Frank, and I just very quickly, Yaakov Emden, and they even got Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz. Anyway, it says they took the wife of the local rabbi, who also belonged to the sect, right? And it was the rabbis in Europe. If they weren't Sabbatine, they were Frankists, and if they weren't, well, it was before Frank, but a lot of the rabbis, a lot of the people were in these cults that looked as if they were Jewish but weren't. But behind closed doors, right, they took a woman, beautiful but lacking discretion, they undressed her naked, placed the crown of the Torah on her head, set her under the canopy like a bride, and danced a dance around her. They celebrated with bread and wine of the condemned, and they pleased their hearts with music like King David. And in dance they fell upon her, kissing her and calling her mezuzah, as if they were kissing a mezuzah. This was happening in Europe, across Europe. The reason Frank became notorious and really made a split was not because he was doing this, because this was happening all over Europe, perhaps especially Eastern Europe. The thing here was that, or at least as Machienko says it, is that they were wearing crucifixes, and the Jews of the time were concerned that the Christians would think that Jews are mocking Christianity. So the other Jews tried to separate from the Frankist Jews by saying they were heretics. The Frankists replied by saying they were the true Jews and everyone else was a heretic. So he says here, okay, what really troubled the rabbinate was the use of Christian symbols in the ritual. Regardless of the Frankist intention, be it antinomian or syncretistic, the use of a cross in the Jewish rite put all the Jews in danger and exposed them to Christian charge of desecration and blasphemy. Etc. So the point is, there was a time here in the 18th century when the Jews were concerned that the Christians couldn't tell them apart from the Frankists, not because they were as worried about these Sabbatine rituals and cults that were happening everywhere, but because they thought the Christians will have a pogrom against all the Jews because of some Jews who are doing something different. Therefore, they tried to make a separation in the same way that Shemoneh ben Kaffa did for the early Christians. I think Jews for Jesus is a similar movement. That Jews for Jesus was founded by Moshe Rosen, who was a Baptist minister, and he realized that he could attract. Well, he couldn't. Jews weren't interested in Jesus, were interested in Christianity rather. So he formed a movement and called it Jews for Jesus, and said he was Jewish and that it was fine for Jews to believe in Jesus and remain Jewish. What he attempted, I think, reasonably unsuccessfully, was to be a Jewish Christian or a Christian Jew, however you put it, and to pose as one of the Jews and yet lead people astray. And the danger of Jews for Jesus is not that they're Christians, that will be fine, but that they claim to also be Jews, perhaps come and attend regular shul services, try and encourage Jews to come to their shul services, and say, we're all the same team, and just also believe in Jesus. And so they got a particularly bad reputation, the Jews for Jesus, because of exactly this idea of pretending to be one thing and really being something else. I think there are many examples. His daughter wrote an article, wrote a book which was reviewed in the Ford, which was interesting. I would say that nowadays there are also groups who claim to be Jewish and are extremely anti-Israel. Again, if somebody is Jewish and wants to protest against Israel, be opposed to the policies of Netanyahu, I have no problem with that. But if somebody who claims to be Jewish and calls for the destruction of all the Jews in Israel, then I think that is a dangerous. We should separate ourselves from them. I put Jewish Voice for Peace because they have been very prominent in the last year on campuses and things like that. But I would include Neturei Karta in this group. They dress up as if they're religious, ultra-Orthodox Jews. But in fact, I think they're absolutely dangerous and terrible, and we should separate ourselves and say they're not part of who we are. Right, Jewish Voice for Peace is the largest progressive Jewish anti-Zionist organization in the world, etc., etc. But after October 7th, right, he maintains solidarity with the Palestinians that really, the Jews deserved it. Fundamentally, it's a radically anti-Israel, anti-Zionist activist group, advocates the boycott of Israel and eradication of Zionism. Eradication of Zionism is code for killing all the Jews. I think any Jews who want to kill 9 million people, 6-7 million Jews, we should say that's not part of who we are. So there are, again, I'm not talking about an individual who says, I disagree with the policies of the Israeli government or I don't like what's happening. Good on them. But an organization that's set up with the goal of undermining what it means to be Jewish, I think it's very dangerous. And I've run out of time, haven't I? I just want to very quickly end. I mentioned this last week, and Lana's alluded to this. Goran Brachot with Rabbi Meir. And Brewer, there were some sinners. Rabbi Meir wanted to pray for the sinners to die. Brewer said to him, don't pray for them to die, pray for them to repent. It's not the sinners who should disappear, it's the sins that should disappear. Rabbi Baruch Me'alei v'hada b'tshuva, Rabbi Meir davened for them and they repented, and that was the end of sin. And so that's, I want to end with that. It's a good thing. Thank you very much. See you all next week, I hope.
Thank you very much. I really